Hello, welcome everyone. Good morning. We're doing this a little bit earlier than usual, so good morning or good afternoon to people in other time zones. My name is Courtney Doggart. I am the president of Network 2020 and am so glad to have all of you join us today for a talk about gender and geopolitics and the role of women in foreign affairs. Just a few words about Network 2020. We are a New York-based nonprofit that is global in nature. We are really trying to bridge the gap between the private sector and the foreign policy worlds, and using our network of entrepreneurial, established and emerging leaders to drive and highlight innovative solutions to foreign policy challenges. And so we do this in a number of ways. We have this virtual briefing series, which is free and open to everyone around the world. And we also have other programs like a deep dive on China. We have entrepreneurial diplomacy program, trips and follow-ups. So there's a lot of different work that we do. So please do check out our website to learn more. One housekeeping announcement that we have the Innovators Awards in Global Affairs competition is open. The deadline is February 19th, and we're looking for nominees of young organizations, young dynamic organizations that are working in sectors that have an impact on foreign policy challenges. So they're all listed below. There's information on our website. It's a really great chance to raise the profile of a small organization that might be doing a lot of good work locally, but that has the potential to really go global in terms of their approach. So yeah, please do check out our website or globalaffairs.innovators.org for more information. So on to the bios of our wonderful panelists. We have Eugenia Podestá, who is a social entrepreneur and a global connector. She has 20 years of experience in nonprofits, leadership, international development, capacity building, networks, and ecosystem building. We found her through the wonderful organization Vital Voices, the Vital Voices Global Partnership, where she oversees a highly competitive one-year accelerator for women-owned small and medium-sized enterprises. She is also the founder of Synergy Co-working in Madison, Wisconsin, which drives collaborative solutions to advance economic empowerment and leadership development for entrepreneurs, women, and communities of color. She was born in Peru and raised in Madison, Wisconsin, and has traveled and worked with leaders and organizations around the world. Next, we have Rachel Vogelstein, who is the Douglas Dillon Senior Fellow and Director of the Women in Foreign Policy Program at the Council on Foreign Relations. She is also a professor of gender and U.S. foreign policy at the Georgetown Law School. Her research is focused on the relationship between women's advancement and prosperity, stability, and security. She was a senior advisor on women's issues for the Hillary for America campaign and developed domestic and foreign global policy, and led a coalition of over 200 women leaders and organizations. She was a director of policy and senior advisor in the Office of Global Women's Issues within the Office of the Secretary of State at the U.S. Department of State, among other things. Last panelist, we have Jenna Ben-Yehuda, who is President and Chief Executive Officer of the Truman National Security Project and the Truman Center for National Policy. She is the founder of the Women's Foreign Policy Network, which is a global membership organization of 5,000 national security professionals in 100 countries. She is a former State Department official. She has private sector experience. She is a member of the World Economic Forum's Global Futures Council on U.S. national security and a life member at the Council on Foreign Relations. She is a frequent media contributor on women's leadership and U.S. national security. And all of this panel will be moderated by Katharine Zaleski, who is named one of Fast Company's most creative people in business after launching PowerToFly. It's a platform that fast tracks economic equality through upskilling and connecting on underrepresented talent to roles in high visibility sectors. Prior to this, she was the founding managing editor of Now This. She was the executive director of digital for the Washington Post and the 6th hire and head of news at the Huffington Post. She is a term member of the Council on Foreign Relations and writes for many major publications. So with that, we're going to turn to our topic, which I think is a very, we have a post-event discussion group, sorry. So if you would like to join us after, we will be holding, for anyone that would like to stay for about 15 minutes, just to talk about what you learned and actually see some of the other people on the call, please feel free to stay after. Brian will put a link in the chat box toward the end of the call, because once you click on that link, you will leave this webinar. So that's why we don't put it on until the end, and it does take a few minutes to get there. So, so we would love for you to join, and it's just a great chance to meet other people and get into some of what you heard. So with that, I think we can turn to the conversation, which I think is a very important one to have, because even, just taking a lens to what we do at Network 2020, I, am always trying to make sure that we have women represented in the panels that we do, but sometimes I do find it a challenge. And I know that our numbers are not 50. And in past positions that I've worked in, this was also a challenge. And I want to give a shout out to someone like Elmira Bairasli at Foreign Policy Interrupted, who are really trying to elevate the voices of women who work in foreign policy, because it is, their voices are extremely critical and often do lead to better outcomes. And so, this is one thing that I will strive to do at Network 2020 is include more women, but it is still a challenge. And so, putting that out there, I will now turn it over to Katharine Zaleski to moderate. So thank you so much all for joining us today.
Wonderful. Thank you, Courtney. Thank you to our wonderful panelists. I remember when Network 2020 was started in around 2003. I think I went to one of the kickoff parties. I still feel very young, but that also sounds very long ago. So 17, no, oh my God, 18 years. Amazing, and all the work that has come together. And I'm also seeing some really great comments and questions that are coming in from people around the world. So we're definitely going to get to those, keep them coming, and we'll thread them through the different questions. I want to start out by establishing an answer to a question that is often asked, but you hear very different answers to, and that's why is gender equity important within foreign policy? And if we could also frame it a little bit in the context of what's happening in the world now, from COVID to a changing administration. I remember reading last year that the CDC, for example, had banned the word, the Trump administration had asked the CDC to ban the word diversity. And I know that there were many programs that also affected foreign policy institutions in the United States that were also told to not even have diversity education and programming as well. So we're in a new age, a new dawn, but I think it's important to also recognize what we're digging out of, for lack of a better phrase. So Jenna, I'm going to kick off with you on establishing why gender equality is important, and also framing it so that people can walk away with this with some good lines. So.
Well, thanks, Katharine, and thanks, Courtney, and to Network 2020. It's great to be here with this panel of women who I've known, most of you, for I think the better part of the last 15 or so years working in this space. So delighted to be here. You know, I don't like this question because it puts the onus on women to defend equity. Mm-hmm. And I think I would put it differently. I would say, how could we possibly afford, in such a complex and interwoven world with so many simultaneous complex crises, how could we possibly afford to exclude half the world's voices? Mm-hmm. We just can't. And the data is there. We know that, for example, like let's step back. October 2020, we've got the 20th anniversary of UN Security Council Resolution 1325, this landmark agreement, which really ushers in a framework to talk about women, peace, and security within the multilateral context. Important stuff, but implementation is lagging. So yeah, you know, we know, for example, that when women are at the table, peace agreements are much more durable, right? They tend to last 15 years or longer. They way outperform agreements where women are not a part of the process. But if we look at the numbers from 95 to 2019, we see women's participation going from 14% to 22%. That's too slow and it's too little. And in 2019, only 6% of women were signatories to peace agreements. So the body of work is there. not denying the impact that all of that has had, but implementation is too slow. And so we're at this place now where I think we need to pivot and we need to flip it and say, it's no longer defensible. It's imperative because there should be nothing about us without us. It works, it's the right thing to do, and policies and programs that don't reflect half of the population are bound to fail. And they're bound to reinforce the same kinds of structures that continue to not produce results. So you can come to it from a rights perspective. It's the right thing to do, the smart thing to do. As Hillary Clinton often says, the data's there. It's just good policy. And we should all be concerned with bringing the very best talent and solutions to the table. So that's what it's really about.
So less of it being a question, more of being obviously a statement that we should be following. I want to go to Rachel next. She's done a lot of great research on this, but also I would love if we could start talking about, where the impediments are so we can start unblocking them more and be aware of it as well. So, Rachel.
Great. Well, I echo everything that Jenna just said and want to thank Network 2020 for convening this important conversation and including me. We have, as Jenna pointed out, just too much evidence in 2021 that no country can get ahead if half of its population is left behind. We know that peace and security processes are stronger when women are involved and at the table. The same data that we see in the realm of peace and security, we also find is true in the area of economic growth. And that's an issue that's of particular importance as we grapple with the kind of worst economic crisis we've faced in generations. The very clear evidence shows that when women are able to participate in the economy on an equal basis with men, that poverty goes down and GDP goes up. And that has proven to be true across different regions of the world, different countries at varying economic levels and degrees of development. This has proven to be true in all parts of the globe. And yet we see that there are a number of barriers. So Katharine, to answer your question, certainly we see legal barriers to women's economic participation. The World Economic Forum has found that there are far too many countries that continue to have laws on the books that inhibit women's ability to participate on a level playing field with men. The World Bank's Women, Business, and the Law report finds that over 100 countries have such laws on the books. And we continue to see that there are policies that too rarely take into account many of these barriers. There are also structural barriers. In some parts of the world, women are less likely to be educated. Girls, particularly adolescent girls, are less likely to have access to education as compared to boys. And we see harmful practices like child marriage that pull adolescent girls out of the education system and truncate their ability to provide for themselves and for their families. And of course, there are cultural barriers. The notion that in some places, men's careers, men's education, boys' education is more prioritized than education and economic opportunity for girls and women goes to deeply rooted cultural norms that continue to shape these outcomes as well. So, I think while we are certainly reeling from the economic crisis that we've endured since the onset of COVID in 2020, we also have an opportunity as we build back our global economy to do so in a way that eliminates these legal, structural, and cultural barriers and allows for the full participation of women in the economy, which is important not just for women and their families, although it certainly is for women and their families, but is important to global economic prosperity.
Great. I want to talk a little bit, Eugenia, I'll go to you next, about structurally what can change within the foreign policy establishment, for lack of a better phrase, and within our own workplaces, we're seeing people come back to work very differently, being able to work remotely. There's been a huge onus on women to take the lion's share of caregiving while working virtually. And so are you seeing this when you run your institutions? How are you making changes around our new reality in order to keep women in the workplace, to keep women rising up through the foreign policy ranks?
So first, thank you, obviously, Network 2020, for the wonderful opportunity to be here with old friends as well and to talk about these wonderful topics that are so important. You know, for us, I come from the nonprofit world, right? And the way that we feed into foreign policy is really through our programming and some of the work that we do in informing what we're seeing on the ground. We've had the it's privilege, right, to be able to do a lot of our work from home, and we've been able to test out seeing how we have to look at more flexible models and really unleash innovation, because in the end, that's what it comes down to. If we look at, you know, both of the points that Jenna and Rachel brought up, solutions are needed, creative solutions that really drive change. And the only way that we're going to do that is by creating more opportunities to have diverse voices at the table and to actually give them the tools that they need to be able to practice and implement some of these opportunities, right? So at Vital Voices, we've actually seen this both internally and externally. You know, all of our programming has focused on convening women in person and seeing how that unleashes a transformation that allows them to take greater risks and succeed, you know, at greater lengths within their various roles. We've had to redesign completely the way that we do things. But at the same time, we've had to do that being mindful of the reality that they live in. And so when we're working with women in over 190 countries around the world, different time zones, different realities, depending on whether they're in rural areas, urban areas, whether they're the breadwinners or not, whether they're running small businesses or nonprofits, we're having to always figure out how to make decisions, taking into account that feedback, those experiences, and how in the end, everything that we do is going to impact them, right? So it is really about collaborative and cooperation around finding decisions and solutions to the problems that we have. But flexibility is key, will continue to be key, and we're going to have to continue to listen and ask those questions and not assume that the decisions that we make, just because they're good for us, are going to be good for everyone. We're you know, absolutely in unprecedented times. We all know that. So we can't solve problems in the same way that we've always done.
Right. Yeah, no, it's really interesting how obviously remote has changed how we convene, and especially when in a world where meeting in person does drive a lot of bonding and also change over time. So it's interesting to see how that might reshape things as well. I'm seeing some questions come in as well, and I want to make sure that I'm keeping this conversation as internationally focused as the title of Network 2020 is. So would love to hear some questions as well that are relevant to people's locations from China to Russia that are tuning in today. Let's talk a little bit about what we're seeing from a more positive aspect with the new administration coming in. Obviously, we've had big changes at the State Department and a real focus on diversity and inclusion. So Jenna, I'm going to kick it back to you a little bit there to talk about that.
Sure. So a couple of thoughts. We have this opportunity we really are at a moment of crisis, right, across so many fronts. And the important opportunity that exists within a crisis is, as Rachel notes, how we build back. So we have the opportunity not to build the same structures that didn't work before, but that is not a given. So we are both at one and the same time, I think, positioned to realize some of the structural changes that might otherwise have taken many decades to implement, but it's not a given. And so, for example, State Department in particular, we know has really been gutted, okay, by the prior administration. And so, but there are still personnel structures that will continue to reinforce some of the same challenges that have been extant. I think Secretary Blinken and his team are really aware of this. There are particular challenges for women. Truman Center for National Policy is releasing a report on rebuilding the State Department in a few weeks that really focuses on retention at the mid-level with an eye towards equity and inclusivity. Because we know that when it comes to building a foreign policy talent pipeline, it's not that there aren't sufficient people coming into the system, it's that the pipeline leaks. People leave government really, and especially women, in that range in their childbearing years because there are structural challenges to staying in the workforce sometimes. So certainly the early executive order repeals that will reinstate diversity training, important, looking at lots of critical and creative ways to bring personnel back into the agency. The funding has to be there. The leadership from the top is important. And I think Secretary Blinken is certainly interested in this and wants to make these things work. We need state appropriations funding in order to support those initiatives. State has been starved for many years from a budgetary aspect. But, you know, look, when my now 13-year-old daughter was born, there were 8 infant beds at the State Department child care facility. I had an easier time getting into college than I did getting my daughter into on-site childcare, right? It's a little bit better now, but these are real issues that plague women's lives and decision-making. And the reality is that State Department is a tough place for working parents. It is not a place that lends itself to people who have caregiving demands. We have to change that in order to bring people in and create conditions that allow people to stay. State Department, the federal government, is an echo of our broader society. And I really do think that we have major systemic structural changes to helping support women. There's an extraordinary series in the New York Times called Primal Scream. I would commend it to everybody. It came out last week. Pooja Lakshman in particular has an article that talks about burnout, but that this comes from a place of structural and societal challenge. Mm-hmm. In other words, it's not on the woman. It's not that you're not making good enough choices or that you could have played something better. It's that there are real barriers to bringing talent in and keeping it there. That's the stuff we need to fix. And I think one of the silver linings of the pandemic is that it really lights on fire the notion that telework is not possible in foreign policy and national security, right? So other things like that extend flexibility, that make all of this more workable, we really need to think about how to continue to build that into the structures of government and not just try to flip a switch and go back to the way things were. Because I'll tell you, I know a lot of folks who realize, oh wait, I captured all this time back on my commute. I can see my kids for dinner now. I'm not going back. Mm-hmm. And the most talented and the most capable people will be those who have the option to leave. And so we have to give, it's flipping the narrative, giving people the impetus to stay instead of this notion that you're the luckiest person in the world to be here. We really need to start thinking about policies that center on valuing people if we're going to repair, because State Department produces ideas, and those ideas come from people, and they've been under-supported for too long. And I think Secretary Blinken and his team are really thinking thoughtfully about how to center the experiences of women and people of color in particular as the central focal point of rebuilding the organization.
Yeah, thank you for that. And you know, what you're pointing out is obviously, it's germane to every sector out there right now. So now I'm going to start going to some questions. This one feeds off nicely what you just said, Jenna, is what are some practical steps that people in leadership, including men, I would say men, and most importantly, must take to advance equity for women in foreign affairs? This shouldn't be an issue where women are the ones who are having to lead on it. Eugenia, I'll go to you. I think you were, you haven't spoken recently.
Well, not being directly in the field, I think one of the most important things is to listen, as we talked about, really understand what the needs are. And when we're making the decisions of going back to what the new normal will be, take that into account, right? So that we're not actually recreating, extending some of these barriers. If these flexible sort of telecommuting options have worked, then let's keep them, right? Let's keep these options open and really think about, as Jenna mentioned, and I can't, you know, what you just shared and captured just hits me right in the heart. It has to be human-centered. You know, we have to remember that these are people that are doing this work, right? And we also want to make sure that we keep them and keep the best, because we need the best in those roles.
Yeah. Rachel, I'm curious from your work, where you've been looking at many other countries and ones that have been doing it better than others, what are some things we can learn as we build back, in the words of Jenna?
You know, I actually just wrote a piece in Foreign Affairs together with some colleagues at the Council and also at the McKinsey Global Institute, kind of looking at policies that have been put into place in this moment of crisis and even before this moment arrived to address some of these structural barriers. You know, the numbers really bear out the kind of challenges that Jenna talked about with respect to the experience that many have had at the State Department. And when you pull back the lens and look across many fields, you know, there are kind of two key issues that have manifested and that have been put in stark relief by this economic crisis. The first is that women are more likely to work in sectors that have proved to be especially vulnerable, whether that's hospitality, education, food service, retail. And the second is that women make less in every country in the world for which we have recorded data as compared to men. So you have women concentrated in low wage work, and you also have a pay disparity even where women are in the same industries as men. And so that means that while women comprise only 39% of the global labor force, they accounted for 54% of pandemic job losses. So women have been disproportionately hit. And when you combine that with some of the structural barriers that we've been talking about, particularly barriers that relate to the care economy, which really runs on the unpaid labor of women, whether it comes to childcare, care for elders, care of the home, you know, that disproportionate burden that has increased as childcare centers and schools have shuttered, as folks have been kind of locked down in their homes. That disproportionate burden has compounded the job losses that women have experienced, making it more likely for women who were in industries that didn't face these disproportionate challenges to then exit the labor force because of these increased burdens of unpaid care work. The bottom line is that there's a lot that governments can do to put policies into place to address these structural barriers. And having a robust childcare system, paid leave system, ensuring that there are adequate options for parents, and ensuring that policies that are put into place are taken up by mothers and fathers alike. Those types of policy reforms have been shown to make a real difference. We've seen that across Europe, particularly in Scandinavia. And tax policy can also make a difference, making it a policy that incentivizes the labor of a secondary earner in a home, as opposed to disincentivizing that work because of a tax burden. Those small changes have been shown to make a real difference. And what has been heartening to see in this incoming administration, Katharine, back to your question about what we might expect to see over the next few years in the United States, is that issues that previously were often talked about as quote unquote women's issues, like childcare, like the unpaid care work that is disproportionately shouldered by women, those issues are now being discussed by this administration as core economic issues. You know, just as we need bridges and roads in order to get to the office in a world where we were all driving to an office, so too do we need to ensure that our childcare centers and our schools are operative and accessible to everyone if we want to ensure that adults can work. So, you know, I think there's a lot to be hopeful about. The notion that these issues are now being discussed as core economic issues as opposed to ancillary to economic concerns. It's really a recognition of the data that we talked about earlier in our conversation that makes it clear that economies grow when the entire population, instead of half the population, is able to participate and thrive. Yeah,
so true. I loved your book. Well, I don't know if you call it a book, but on building inclusive economies. I don't want to intimidate people by calling it a book because it's a great quick read. So from the council.
Katharine, sorry,
yes.
can I just jump in on Rachel's point? Because I think this is really, really critical. Rachel's taught, when you were saying, Rachel, that caregiving needs to be thought of in the same way as we think about bridges and roads. I want to just underscore that. We need to think about education and caregiving structures as critical infrastructure. Mm-hmm. In the way that we organize our government, Department of Homeland Security in the United States has around 20 critical infrastructure categories. Hospitals are in there, nuclear power plants are in there, schools are not in there. And we can't get this country back to work if we don't get our kids back to school. And the absence of that kind of thinking structurally with budgets and strategies behind it is killing American lives and is killing our economy and is really setting women back potentially for decades. So really centering those conversations in structural ways. Education and caregiving are the unsung critical infrastructure pillars of our society, and they are being underserviced, and it's hurting us deeply.
Yes. Thank you for underscoring that. The other thing I also want to underscore is that when we talk about women, we really have to look at the intersectional nature of women's lives. So my life is very different than someone who doesn't look like me, has very different caregiving needs, very different financial needs. And I often have this concern that when we talk about women, we don't talk about Black women who've been hurt much more in the pandemic, women of color who really, and who are in that cohort of losing many of the service jobs that won't even come back. So there is a good question here about, sorry, I have to scroll up. There's so many good questions in here, but how do we enable women of color who are often even more marginalized to get involved in foreign policy? Who wants to take that one?
I'm happy to jump in. I mean, I think that's such a critical issue. And Katharine, what you're highlighting in terms of the particular economic crisis borne by women of color, we've seen that here in the US and in other countries around the world. The most recent jobs report here showed that all of the jobs lost in the last report, it was 100,000 jobs, were lost by women of color. And that shows that the disproportionate burden that you just talked about, but the same challenges that you just identified also exist when it comes to representation in our foreign policy and national security establishment, and of course, across our culture. I think there's a few answers. The first is data. I think we need to start by making sure we are measuring diversity and inclusion. We do what we measure, what we count, and there are so many instances in which we're not even keeping track of the numbers. We don't always have sex, race, or age disaggregated data, and we need to start there by making sure we have an appropriate benchmark and baseline from which to improve. I think we also need to think more about targets. I know quota is often a word that is considered to be an anathema in the United States, although interestingly, we are happy to export quotas through our work in other countries and our development work around the world. But I think we should think about, what a diverse and inclusive table looks like, making sure in particular that at leadership tables that we have a representation that reflects the actual population, and making sure that there are benchmarks set and policies change in order to actually change those outcomes. So I would start with data, and then I would encourage concrete metrics in order to see change.
If I can indulge for a second and share some of the data that I see every day. I run a recruiting platform for diversity, and we have 25 million people in the database and very large clients. And if I were in a room with you all right now, I'd ask you to raise your hand to give me the answer to this question. But if you're trying to recruit mid to senior level women, diverse women with a focus on diverse women for Microsoft's Azure data unit, I often ask people, how many women do you think you need to start out with to reach? And people say, I don't know, 100, 150. The answer is to get about 100 in the room for a recruiting event, you need to start out with about 5,000 names. And part of the problem there is the fact that diverse women have been turned away from these organizations for so many years and generations that they feel like they could never belong there. And you have to do the work at the top of the funnel to convince them first that they could belong within these organizations. And that takes a huge amount of work, and often events, many virtual events now, to make that happen. So I wanted to share that quickly on the data point, but then get into a question of how do you actually train people? Because I don't know if you can get to those thousands of numbers in these jobs that we're talking about in foreign policy. So, Eugenia, I'm gonna kick it over to you and ask about upskilling and apprenticeships and the work that needs to be done there.
A lot of work needs to be done there, right? But I think it even starts sooner than that. Access to information. If we think about the pipelines of foreign policy, where does it start? Right? If we're not getting representation, even through the college levels, or even before students enter into college, seeing it as a viable profession. If I think about foreign policy, to me, is one of those fields that it still continues to appear and be very exclusive, right? And a lot of times you don't even consider it as an option unless you know people or have been exposed to it or become really passionate about the issues at an early age. So what are we doing to bridge those gaps and really getting into the communities to allow for development and interest in this space, right? And I think mentoring, apprenticeships, internships, all of those things are very important. But even just having conversations, that happens to me all the time. Again, I live here in Wisconsin now. I've lived in DC for a long time, and returning the conversations that I have in my community, it's just astounding how there's just a lack of understanding of the possibilities. And it's like, wow, how did you even do the work that you do? Like, how did you get there? Like, it's almost something that's unreachable. So we have to really be clear about what are the pathways and making sure that we're putting the work in to creating more access and opportunity for others.
Yeah. I mean, I want to go to a question from the audience that touches on this. The person is asking a great question, but I hate how this is always framed. Going back to questions we hate that Jenna brought up, which is this question of like, if you recruit more diverse people, could you be lowering the bar? And I hate that question because I'll give you a personal anecdote really quickly and let someone else answer it. It's like, my father is a member of the Council on Foreign Relations. I got an interview there out of college with no foreign policy experience because he got me the interview. And so much of that, like, talk about lowering the bar. Luckily, I ended up working in journalism and building news organizations, but the bar is too damn low. So anyway, Jenna, I think sometimes.
Yeah,
maybe I'm wrong
so much there. Yeah, sure. I mean, just to tease out what Rachel is saying, and to your question, Katharine, on women of color in this space, data is important, collection's important, but transparency and accountability are key, and that have to go hand in hand with data. We can't cast a net. You can't just toss out a net and try to pull it in and say, well, I didn't catch any diverse fish. Mm-hmm. You have to really make an effort. And I say this as an employer and a hiring official. We do really engaged outreach to historically Black colleges and universities. The work that Bonnie Jenkins is doing through Women of Color Advancing Peace and Security is really important work. And if you're not familiar with the organization, I really suggest you take a look at it for those listening. People need to see themselves in organizations. Katharine, to your point about there's nobody here that looks like me. So representation matters, certainly. Employers also can do a lot to change the perception. That comes back to things like posting salary ranges for positions that are available, not requiring salary history, which can reinforce wage gaps. For example, looking at if you have a position and you don't have a certain number of applicants who are representative of diverse groups, well, you got to start over again because something is wrong with what you're doing, the way that you've written it, your requirements, or you're not talking to the right people. So this notion that, oh, we didn't get anybody, it's lazy and you can't do it anymore. Right? I mean, Rachel may remember, I used to work on the International Women of Courage Award at the State Department. And I did this for the Latin America Bureau. And we had 35 embassies come in. And Eugenia, I know you worked on this as well. And I remember an embassy saying to me, in a nation of 12 million people, we didn't submit this year because we couldn't find anybody. Really. In a nation of 12 million people, there wasn't one courageous woman doing something worth giving an award. Folks, it doesn't cut it anymore. And employers are going to be left behind. Mm-hmm. There is a war for talent. And folks are going to be left on the sidelines if they don't get this right. And I think something that all of us can do are ask, the boards of organizations, are they diverse? I don't contribute to organizations that don't have diverse boards. I don't share positions that don't have salary ranges expressed. I call it Find Your Five. So in Truman, we recruit every year. We are asking people to identify 5 people, and 3 of those should be diverse candidates as we bring them into membership. So you're making that part of what you're building. But it's also Find Your Five. If I couldn't do this panel, I know 5 other women, most of them people of color, who I could recommend instead. So it's also thinking about, Katharine, to your point about CFR and those connections, how can we bring people into this? And do a lot of listening, because we also can't get into conversations about tokenism and just reaching out to people. Having somebody who's a person of color come in and they're the person who's in charge of the diversity program, that doesn't work either. So we need to do a lot of listening, and employers need to not just say Black Lives Matter, though they should. They need to show up and demonstrate how they are enacting policies and procedures that will bring structural change and really recognize it's time for more than words, it's time for commitments. And to all the amazing folks of various backgrounds who are looking at this field, we need you. We need you now more than we ever have before. And American exceptionalism and the failure to have policies that really speak to all of the experience of Americans around the country is a reflection in large part of the lack of diversity, the kind of priesthood that Eugenia is talking about. So we have to be the change and work it from both sides in order to get it right.
You got an amen from the audience on the lazy point. I do want to say as well, back to the data of reaching out to 3,000 women on behalf of Microsoft, it takes 7 emails and multiple text messages to also get them in the room. So conversion is key. You get about a 2% conversion rate and you really have to work at it. I want to go to another question here that brings it back to men. What advice do you have for working men in countries where women aren't always respected as equals? Occasionally, to expedite things, I invite a male counterpart to just be on the call and agree with me so things can move forward. But it feels like it's perpetuating the issue. This makes me think of what happened in the Obama administration with this concept of co-elevating, I think it was called, where women would say, yes, Eugenia, that's a great point. Or yes, Rachel, Rachel's being interrupted. Can we hear Rachel? So curious, some experiences there. Oh, Rachel, we haven't heard from you in a while.
It's a terrific question. And I want to actually just jump back to reinforce the point that Jenna just made and to kind of respond to this kind of false conflict between experience and qualifications on the one hand and having a diverse candidate pool or a diverse workforce on the other hand. We just have too much evidence at this point that there are barriers that are standing in the way of having a diverse workforce in many fields, and certainly in foreign policy and national security, to kind of fall upon that false divide any longer. You know, I did some research with a colleague at the council on peacekeeping, and what we found, you know, notwithstanding the age-old binders full of women question that Jenna referenced, where you know, again and again, we were told that we just couldn't find qualified women to serve in peacekeeping forces around the world. When we looked at the evidence, what we found is that women were actually being trained, but they weren't being deployed. And this was despite their interest in being deployed. And so that gets to a whole host of questions about why that is. But what we know is that peacekeeping outcomes are stronger when you have a diverse peacekeeping force. And so, you know, I think really the question we ought to be asking is, what is the reason to defend the status quo in which we are not capitalizing on 100% of the talent and innovation, and when we know that we have worse outcomes when we fail to have a diverse workforce? You know, I think women's leadership, I think in particular in this moment of crisis, has certainly caused many to stand up and take notice. There are researchers that found in COVID response that female-led countries actually fared better than male-led countries in terms of, you know, absolute number of COVID deaths, that female-led countries are more likely to lock down earlier, and therefore their economies more likely to rebound faster. Does that mean women are better? Not at all. It means that having a diversity of opinions at a leadership table can make a difference in improving what the ultimate outcome looks like. So, you know, I think it just couldn't be more important as we're building back from a crisis to make sure we're capitalizing on 100% of the talent. And in terms of men and boys, you know, the involvement of men and boys is absolutely critical in solving these challenges. You know, I think it's really notable that the current administration has appointed for the first time ever a White House Gender Policy Council that will operate alongside the National Security Council, the Domestic Policy Council, and the National Economic Council in the White House. And notably, the focus is not just on women and girls, it's on gender. And so I think, you know, thinking about the ways in which these issues affect all of us, men and women, boys and girls alike, gender non-conforming people, you know, I think this is an opportunity for us to take stock of a new set of solutions that not only engage 100% of the population, but benefit 100% of the population.
Yeah. I'll give you another quick council anecdote. Every time I would go to the council in person, a man would come up to me and say, "Can you take my daughter to coffee?" And I'd say, "How about I take your son to coffee?" Like, why don't you ask me for your son, you know, to take your son out instead? Give him some advice. Or tell him what it's like a little bit. You talked a little bit about the countries that have women leaders leading them and how they've been able to tackle COVID successfully. There's a great question from Joanna Vogelstein, who says, you know, are there any commonalities in these women leaders? Have you seen them when you're in your through your work as well, and can you share them? So I might go to each of you quickly on this, but Eugenia, I'll go to you first.
Sure, yeah, there have been commonalities that we've been able to identify, one of which is collaboration, right? Empathy is another one. You know, I always try to not err on the side of generalizations because I find them to be very dangerous, right? Like women lead perfectly and we're the answers to all problems. I don't agree with that. I think it's more women with certain traits and have the ability to engage in leadership in a way that is looking at the benefits of all and not just their own trajectory is really the solution, right? And so when you look beyond yourself and really think about the impact and the greater good, I think you're able to make sounder decisions. You're also able to share what some of those ideas are to get feedback. And I think that's another very important component, listening to others. Then also taking risks. I think that is a huge part of it. You have to be comfortable with making mistakes. And that's not easy when there's so much at stake, right? Yeah. You have to be able to do that. Another element, and we actually have a book that has captured a lot of leadership traits and qualities that we've seen over 2 decades of work that we've done with women leaders, is crossing lines that divide, right? You see that there are divisions, but we have to really figure out a way to reach out, bring others in, and think about how we, again, work towards the greater good.
Yeah. Michelle Bachelet asked a good question too about like a more feminine style and how that could actually be helpful to both men and women, frankly. I want to go to Jenna with this question about commonalities, but also bring it back to the organization. So it's not just on women, like commonalities in women, but also the organizations that have lifted them up. So.
Yeah, I mean, to Eugenia's important point, it's not that women, you know, by virtue of their sex organs or women identifying are like inherently a certain way. It is born of lived experience, right? You know, if you're a mother, you've done conflict resolution work, I guarantee it, right? I mean, look, folks, you know, it's the reality. You know, if women have to work twice as hard to get half as far, they're crossing lines to do it. They're doing a lot of listening. They're showing empathy because they're looking for clues. So when we talk about diverse viewpoints, well, we're kind of talking about big data. You know, folks seem to understand the value of big data, and we want to figure out how to get the best supercomputing so we can crunch it and make sense of it. Women are that data. Women are bringing perspectives and experience. And so I think we need to think about it in that way. We wouldn't otherwise say, you know, hey, I have a failing business that's lost profit year on year. Let's keep going with the same strategies. But that's effectively what we're talking about when we talk about continuing to exclude women leaders. So, you know, I would just put it out there. And certainly there's a role for men at every level, just as there are for women, but men can model that kind of good leadership for other male counterparts and ask the question, are there other women on that panel? Or reinforce certain points and say, you know, thanks for asking me, but there are 3 other women I'd like to recommend instead. You know, leadership comes from the top when it depends on structural organizational change and budgets to back certain initiatives, absolutely. But that doesn't absolve folks at other levels from taking action. There is something that every single person can do, no matter what their level. And the important piece here is to show up and to demand that kind of accountability.
Definitely. Rachel?
You know, there's a story that Secretary Clinton liked to tell when it came to, you know, the importance of including women in peace and security processes, about a peace negotiation in Sudan over control of a particular river. And, you know, men on both sides had been going for several rounds with no end in sight. And finally, one emerged from the negotiation, and the women who had not been permitted to participate asked where the negotiation stood. And upon hearing that the dispute was over this river, they couldn't believe it, because they knew that that river had long since dried up. Now, why did they know that? They knew that because they were more likely to be the ones to wash clothes, which they did in that river. And so it's not to suggest that one group is better than another group. It's just that groups are different and have different sources of information, different perspectives, and that the multiplicity of those perspectives can strengthen the information that would contribute to a positive outcome. So that's the bottom line, is ensuring that we're capitalizing on 100% of the talent, 100% of the innovation, 100% of the information. And we can only do that if we truly have a diverse group.
That's great. So I think we're wrapping up here. I mean, one thing I'll point out about representation is I always look at the percentages of the demographic breakups per the area that I'm talking to or around the topic. So it's always very helpful when you're coming in and putting together a panel as well and saying, you know, is this panel reflective, for example, of the population that you're trying to speak to? So I would argue even this panel could be a little bit more diverse, and I should have raised the flag last week on it and made some suggestions. So So it's always important to also be checking back in on that. Let's see if we can go with any more questions. I think, I mean, we can wrap up with, how about we'll each wrap up with a quick silver lining point from each of you on what can be built back better, you know, through COVID. So Jenna, I'll start with you.
So I'll offer this. Teleworking, flexibility, it's the future of work. And we've seen through COVID that organizations that have made that pivot effectively are the ones who are going to thrive on the other side of this. And so going back to anything short of at least having a flexibility conversation is going to make organizations less agile and less resilient to crisis. So that's a small silver lining, but it really depends on getting that caregiving arc right, because you can have all the flexibility in the world, but if you don't have the caregiving to back it up, it's a hollow promise.
Eugenia.
So for me would be that we've learned a lot, right? There's a lot of resilience, there's a lot of innovation, there's a lot of amazing solutions out there. We need to do more ceding power, actually extending agency and allowing for these new innovative solutions, new frameworks, new ways of doing work to actually replace the old systems that didn't work. So that's what I would close with.
Thank you. And Rachel.
The word I would use, which happens to be the title of a forthcoming book that is out in July, is awakening. I think that what is often born out of a crisis is an awakening. And the truth is, many of the structural and cultural barriers that exist that we're now grappling with as we rebuild from this economic crisis long predated it, but we've been awakened to them. And so, you know, I think one glass half full perspective is that now we have a chance, given the widespread recognition and the experience that so many people who previously had ignored these challenges before have had over the last, you know, now close to 1.5 years, that there's an opportunity, I think, now that there is more awareness and people are awake to these challenges, to make sure that we build in proper solutions.
Mm-hmm. Great. I concur. So Courtney, I'm going to hand it back to you to wrap us up. Thank you, everybody. This was fantastic, and I learned a lot. And the audience questions were wonderful.
Yes, just to echo the thanks. A big thanks to all of you for joining us today, taking time out of your very busy schedules, which I know you're also juggling the work and the childcare and everything in between. Just a huge vote of appreciation for all the work that you do. And again, to echo Katharine's point, thanks to the audience for a lot of terrific questions. And I think in the future, we can also rethink how we do this panel too, because I realize that so often when we talk about women's issues, we keep it siloed, and I had a panel of all women, and I think it really actually would have been more interesting if we had someone who identified as a man on here as well, but next time. So thank you all. Our next event that's open to the public is a rescheduling of one that was canceled last week because of the blizzard. Minutes to Midnight, the 2021 Doomsday Clock Explained, which is a wonderful instrument of assessing how close we are to human-led destruction with our various technologies. And so we'll be speaking with Rachel Bronson and Herb Lynn. So it should be a terrific talk. So please do register. That's February 16th from 12 to 1. A few other items, if you would like to join our post-event discussion group to keep this conversation going, there is a QR code in the middle. I think also in the chat, there should be a link, but as soon as you click on that link, you will leave this webinar, just so you know, and it will take a few minutes for us just to get everything up to speed. So, and then lastly, we are a nonprofit. I really would love to keep these briefings free and open to everyone around the world, especially as we're looking at eventually a post-COVID world where I know Network 2020 will go back to doing in-person. I very much would love to keep these events going because we are able to reach people in 90 countries around the world and throughout the United States. And I think that is to the point about hearing more voices and reaching more people. I think it's extremely critical to keep this going. So with that, thanks to all of you, and I hope to see some of the audience in the post-event discussion. So have a wonderful day, everyone.